I was arrested in 1975 and tortured. I feared being rearrested. I was rearrested for 27 months, of which 18 were in solitary confinement. They allowed me, when I asked, to have a pet bird. More important to me has been to practice what I believe.
Raymond Suttner was jailed in 1975 for 8 years for his activities as an ANC and SACP underground operative, which is described in one of his works, Inside Apartheid's Prison, in 2001. He was also the author, with the SACP's Jeremy Cronin, of 30 Years of the Freedom Charter in 1987 and, most recently, the ANC Underground in South Africa in 2008. Raymond, with the 100th year anniversary of the ANC coming up in 2012, please describe the evolution of the ANC over the decades of resistance to colonialism and apartheid.
The ANC was born in the wake of the defeat of a number of chiefdoms throughout and kingdoms throughout what became South Africa. There's no such thing as South Africa until 1910. In the wake of that, some Xhosa poets wrote about the time of the spear being over and this being the time of the pen. Now, the ANC was formed as the South African Native National Congress as the time of the pen and the time of the suit, when initially they spent a lot of time petitioning the imperial government and later the South African government. And however, it's wrong to treat this as moderate. It was reading the signs of the time, that you had to move away from the spear, and it was the type of politics that was opening was the politics where you wore suits. Over a number of decades, the attempts at petitioning appeared to fail, and the Youth League was formed in the 1940s at the same time as the leadership of the ANC fell under Dr. Xuma and Reverend, later Canon Xalata, both of whom tried to organize the ANC on a sound basis. Now, the Youth League is remembered because of their very radical claims and demands, but it would not have been possible to achieve what they wanted without the basis that had been laid by Xalata and Xuma. So the importance is to understand that ideas in the ANC history can only be realized when there's organization. And in the 1950s, the ANC Youth League program was put into practice under the leadership of Sisulu, who was elected Secretary General of the ANC, and they started with the Defiance Campaign. The Defiance Campaign is very, very important in South African history because that was a declaration that the ANC did not owe allegiance, and all others who defied with them, because they had what was called the Congress Alliance of Indian Congress, Congress of Democrats and Whites, South African Congress of Trade Unions, Coloured People's Congress, separate organizations in a multiracial alliance. Now, they broke the law. It also shows something about the type of leadership of the time. During this period, they defied, but they also created the Freedom Charter. And toward the end of the decade, the ANC was banned, but declared it would continue to exist. So the decade began with the Defiance Campaign and it ended with a defiant claim that it would continue to exist. MK Umkhonto weSizwe, the Spear of the Nation, was formed in 1961, and its activities then were short-lived because most of the leadership were rounded up. The leadership then shifted to exile, and this doesn't mean the ANC didn't continue to exist inside with underground groupings re-establishing themselves, but the presence was not very significant. ANC had a lot of difficulty establishing itself outside and forming Umkhonto weSizwe into a military wing that could pose some sort of threat. They were not getting very far with armed struggle. There was very great difficulty infiltrating into the country. The underground was developing, but it was not a threat. Public activities were very difficult to conduct. The 1976 rising developed. ANC had nothing to do with that directly, but there were connections between black consciousness individuals and some ANC underground people. This may be one of the reasons why most of the 1976 generation, when they left the country, joined ANC. And they helped to revive the morale of the cadres of Umkhonto weSizwe, and this led to some attacks in the late 1970s on police stations and government installations. And we must see this was very inspiring to people, that an army of African people who had never been trained inside had acquired the skills to attack police installations. And this helped revive popular struggle inside the country, which is escalated in the 1980s with the United Democratic Front, South Africa being made ungovernable, popular power based on street committees, sometimes deteriorating into abuse when the leadership got arrested. A lot of the leadership were arrested in 1986. Towards the end of the 1980s, in spite of the arrest of the leadership, it was not possible for the apartheid regime to make South Africa governable again. This was clear when they had local government elections in 1988 or 1989. I think it was 1989, and no, 88, because I had just come out of detention and I was under house arrest, and they were not able to. Police had been chased out of the townships, local government had collapsed, etc. So on the one hand, they couldn't sustain governability, but on the other hand, the ANC did not have the capacity to overthrow the regime. Now this is a situation which makes it possible for a negotiated settlement. There was a reciprocal siege, as Antonio Gramsci calls it. Neither party was on its knees. Now that paved the way for talks and the elections which elected an ANC government, but it also set in train a process whereby popular activity, mass activity, as was seen in the 1980s, started to be demobilized and only used as a type of battering ram when negotiations were not going in favor of the ANC demands.
Now you mentioned this almost centralization of the ANC when it became a government. What has this meant for mass participation and organization?
We have to evaluate centralization, collectivization in context. Now the problem is many of us kept our habits of underground into the UDF. I was used to operating secretively, say, and I'm used to, in my own case, many of us are used to not doing things without checking it out with someone else. Centralization in the present is partly derived from the collectivism being a necessary project but not being timeless in its applicability, in that centralization always has a tendency to suppress individual conscience and individual views. Now, we never thought beyond that model, which is a top-down model. We never thought of democratized civil service. This is the pattern which also got encouraged under the leadership of Mandela unwittingly, because he was such a giant, and Mbeki especially, that you don't express your view until you know what the chief will say. The ANC leadership centralization has tended within the organization to curb debate, such as we used to have in the 1980s. There was not a lot of debate after 1990.
Now, with regard to the ANC's long history as a revolutionary movement, do you think that there is a tendency for liberation movements to blur the distinction between state and party?
We must read this not merely as a blurring of distinctions between state and a ruling organization, but the exercise of patronage. Insofar as tenders may be rigged, and we read about this all the time, they are not rigged in favor of the ANC as such, but sections of the ANC who benefit. I'm not saying that there was an absence of the blurring under Mbeki period and the Mandela period, but it's reached a level of intensity. But we must remember, not all ANC people benefit, and there's a specific grouping. And in fact, one of the reasons for paralysis today is there's a fight over loot. There's very little ideology. In the whole period of democratic rule, there's very little debate. If you take this concept of revolution, what does it mean? I mean, are we in a revolutionary situation now? If we are operating not with guns. The ANC planned to smash the state. They never did that. There hasn't been thought about operating on a terrain of reform.
Next time we will talk about models of ANC leadership in Reflections with Raymond Suttner.
An individual did not decide, but that it was more democratic. We sometimes commit self-conception of royalty. The question is the relationship between collectivism and centralization. Couldn't carry it off. He didn't have the prestige of Mandela. We never fully came to terms with the past.